Tonight, we're exploring how cavemen survived the last ice age, a time when freezing winds howled, mammoths roamed, and staying alive meant mastering fire, shelter, and a whole lot of luck. You'd wake up to bitter cold and no central heating in sight. Meals were whatever you could hunt, gather, or scrape together before frostbite set in. Cave walls became your calendar, fire was your lifeline, and teamwork wasn't just nice, it was necessary. So before you get comfortable as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're already a part of the crew. Also, please let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for. We appreciate the recent feedback on you guys not wanting harsh topics that may be interpreted from a personal experience and are dialing back to some calm and collected stories. Now dim your lights, grab your blanket, and let's start. I'm sure you'll love this one. Picture yourself settling into the evening warmth of your shelter 30,000 years ago. The fire crackles softly beside you, casting dancing shadows on stone walls that have become more familiar than any home you've ever known. Outside, the wind carries a different song than it did in your grandfather's time, sharper, colder, with an edge that speaks of changes your people are still learning to understand. You weren't born when the world began its slow slide toward endless winter. Your grandmother used to tell stories of forests that stretched beyond the horizon, of berries so abundant they stained your fingers purple for days, and of rivers that never wore their crystal armour of ice. Those tales felt like dreams, warm and impossible, told around fires that seemed smaller each passing season. The change didn't announce itself with fanfare. Nature rarely does. Instead, it whispered its intentions through subtle signs that took generations to decode. Winters stretched a little longer. Spring arrived with hesitant steps. The great herds began their migrations earlier, then later, along paths that made no sense to hunters who had followed the same routes for countless seasons. Your people adapted the way humans always have, not with grand gestures, but with 1,000 small adjustments that felt natural at the time. When the familiar berry bushes failed to thrive, you learned which bark could be chewed for sustenance. When the streams began freezing solid, you discovered that certain stones, when heated by the fire, could be wrapped in hide and tucked against your body to ward off the bone-deep cold that crept in during the longest nights. The mammoths, those walking mountains of fur and wisdom, became your unwitting teachers. You watched them strip bark from trees with their enormous trunks and learned which varieties held the most nutrition. You observed how they used their tusks to dig through snow to reach the hardy grasses beneath, and copied their technique with your tools, crude but effective. But perhaps the most important lesson came from watching how they moved together. Never alone, always in their family groups, sharing warmth, sharing knowledge, and sharing the burden of survival. Your people had always been social creatures, but the growing cold taught you that cooperation wasn't just pleasant, it was essential. The caves you called home grew more crowded, but also more warm. Bodies pressed together meant sharing heat, stories, and hope. The elders, once content to sit apart in quiet contemplation, became the keepers of crucial knowledge. They remembered which plants could be dried and stored, which animal behaviours predicted harsh weather, and which techniques worked best for preserving meat when hunting was beneficial. You learned to read the sky with new eyes. Cloud formations that once simply promised rain now held messages about the severity of coming storms. The way snow fell, thick and wet or fine and stinging, told you whether to venture out for supplies or hunker down for days. Even the behaviour of small creatures became a language you needed to understand. When the hardy ground squirrels disappeared deeper into their burrows, you knew to do the same. The fire never went out. That became your tribe's most sacred rule, more important than any ceremony or tradition. Someone always watched the flames, fed them carefully hoarded fuel, and protected them from wind and rain, and the 1,000 things that could steal away your lifeline to warmth and light. The firekeepers developed an almost mystical understanding of wood and tinder, knowing instinctively which materials would burn longest, which would provide the most heat, and which could be coaxed into flame even when damp. As you lay here listening to the eternal conversation between flame and fuel, you can almost sense the generations of your ancestors who sat in similar spots, watched similar fires, and made daily decisions that determined whether they would see another sunrise or succumb to the cold. Their wisdom flows through you like warmth from the hearth, an inheritance more precious than any material treasure. Morning arrives with the particular silence that only deep snow can create. You wake to a world muffled and transformed, where familiar landmarks hide beneath white blankets, and every step outside requires careful consideration. This is your daily puzzle now, reading the landscape that changes overnight, learning to see opportunity where others might see only obstacle. Your feet have grown wise over the years, knowing without looking where the hidden rocks create solid footing, and where the snow might give way to reveal a twisted ankle or worse. You've learned to trust the subtle messages your body sends, the way your breathing changes in different kinds of cold, how your skin tingles when the air holds the promise of more snow, and the particular ache in your joints that means the weather will shift before nightfall. The hunting has changed, becoming more of a chess game than a chase. The large prey animals have developed their own survival strategies, clustering in sheltered valleys, growing thicker coats, and becoming more wary and difficult to approach. But you've noticed something interesting. They're also becoming more predictable in some ways. Desperation creates patterns, and trends create opportunities for those patient enough to observe and learn. You've found that tracking in snow presents both advantages and challenges compared to the mud during warmer seasons. The prints tell clearer stories, how long ago the creature passed, whether it was healthy or struggling, and whether it was alone or part of a group. However, snow also deceives, shifting and drifting, concealing tracks or generating false ones as wind patterns manipulate the accumulated powder. The smaller prey has become your specialty. Rabbits, ptarmigan, and the occasional beaver, when you can find open water, are creatures that might have gone unnoticed in times of plenty, but now represent the difference between a successful day and an empty belly. You've learned to think like them, to understand how they move through their frozen world, where they shelter, and what drives them from safety into the open where patient hunters wait. Ice fishing has become an art form in your tribe. The elders teach youngsters to read the ice like a book, where it's thick enough to support a person's weight, where the fish gather in the deeper pockets that don't freeze solid, and how to cut holes without creating dangerous weaknesses in the surface. There's a meditative quality to sitting beside these holes, wrapped in furs, waiting for the subtle tug that means dinner. But perhaps the most crucial skill you've developed is the ability to recognise what you call gift days. Those unexpected breaks in the weather when the sun shines with almost forgotten warmth, when the wind dies down to a whisper, when the world briefly remembers what kindness feels like. These days are precious beyond measure, opportunities to venture farther from shelter, check trap lines, and gather the last stubborn berries that somehow survived the latest freeze. On gift days, you can almost pretend that this endless winter might be temporary, that somewhere beyond the horizon, the world still holds green places where life continues in the old ways. But you've grown too wise to let such thoughts linger long. Hope is useful, but only when balanced with realistic preparation for what tomorrow might bring. The night sky has become your calendar and compass. With so many landmarks buried under snow, navigation relies more heavily on the stars that shine with crystalline clarity through the cold, thin air. You've learned constellations your grandmother never needed to know, and seasonal patterns that help track the slow passage of time when each day blends into the next in an endless cycle of survival tasks. Your hands have become tools as specialised as any carved implement. Your fingers can detect the difference between snow that will compact into building material and snow that will only frustrate construction efforts. Your palms can gauge the heat radiating from stones around the fire, knowing precisely when they're ready to be wrapped and used for warming beds or drying damp clothing. The rhythm of your days has settled into patterns that would seem monotonous to someone from easier times, but you've learned to find subtle variations that keep life exciting. The way morning light hits the ice formations outside your shelter changes daily, creating a natural artwork that costs nothing to enjoy. The sounds your fellow tribe members make as they go about their tasks become a familiar symphony that speaks of safety and community. Even your dreams have adapted to this frozen world, filled with images of warmth and abundance that feel less like memories and more like promises, visions of a future when the ice retreats and the world remembers how to be green again. You've become a master of the almost good enough, the nearly perfect solution, and the creative workaround that turns potential disaster into minor inconvenience. Every morning, just like every other, presents a small crisis that requires resolution, using whatever materials are readily available within your shelter's reach. Today's challenge: The binding on your best winter boot has finally given up, worn through by countless miles of walking on surfaces that would have destroyed footwear in days rather than seasons, back when replacement materials were easily found. But replacement isn't really the right word anymore. Nothing gets replaced. Everything gets repaired, repurposed, and reimagined into something that serves the same function, more or less for a little while longer. You evaluate your options with the expertise of someone who has tackled similar issues numerous times. The leather strips you've been saving might work, but they're earmarked for a repair to the shelter's door covering that becomes more urgent with each windstorm. The sinew from last week's successful hunt is already spoken for. Promise to reinforce the handles on tools that can't afford to fail at crucial moments. Then you remember the inner bark technique one of the elders demonstrated last autumn, back when such knowledge felt like intriguing trivia rather than essential survival skills. Certain trees, even in their winter dormancy, hold flexible fibres just beneath their outer bark. Finding the right tree means a cold walk through snow that comes up to your thighs, but the alternative is spending the rest of winter with inadequate footwear, which isn't really an alternative at all. The expedition becomes an opportunity to check the trap lines you set 3 days ago, a hopeful exercise that pays off more often than you might expect. Small creatures continue to move through their frozen world, following needs and instincts that make them predictable to anyone who has learned to think like prey rather than predator. You find evidence of activity, tracks that speak of desperate hunger overcoming natural caution, the kind of desperation that drives animals into situations they would normally avoid. This knowledge feels like holding a secret, understanding something about how survival changes behaviour in ways that can be anticipated and used. The bark harvesting requires patience and technique that would have baffled your younger self. If you are overly aggressive, you risk damaging the tree beyond its capacity to recover when the warmer weather returns. If you are overly cautious, you may not obtain sufficient material to justify the effort. The balance point exists in that narrow space between waste and want, the place where most of your decisions live these days. Back at the shelter, the work of preparation begins. We must process, soften, and braid the bark to make it sturdy enough to withstand another season of rigorous use. Your hands know this work intimately now, fingers moving with practiced efficiency, while your mind wanders to other problems that need solving. The food stores require constant attention and creative management. What seemed like adequate supplies when the snow began to fall now need to be stretched further than originally planned. You've learned to make soup from ingredients that would have been discarded in easier times, bones boiled until they release every possible nutrient, vegetation that provides bulk if not flavour, and combinations that work better than their individual components suggest they should. But perhaps the most important thing you've learned is how to turn scarcity into a kind of game. Discovering innovative methods to utilise well-known materials turns into a challenging task that is rewarding in its own right. Creating comfort from unlikely sources develops into a skill set that makes you valuable to your community in ways that go beyond simple survival. The evening fire becomes your workshop, a place where damaged items get evaluated for repair potential, where materials get sorted and assessed for future projects, and where the day's small victories get shared with others who understand the satisfaction of making something work when it really shouldn't. Your fellow tribe members have developed their own specialties born from necessity. One member of your tribe discovered how to make glue from fish bones and tree sap. One individual has mastered the art of weaving grass into waterproof containers. The individual who learned to predict weather changes by watching how the smoke from your fire behaves in different atmospheric conditions. These skills create a web of interdependence that makes everyone more secure. When your boot repair technique works perfectly, others learn from watching. When someone else solves a problem you've been struggling with, the knowledge becomes shared property, part of the collective wisdom that keeps the group alive. The satisfaction that comes from successful improvisation feels different from any pleasure you experienced in easier times. It's deeper, more fundamental, tied to the basic animal pleasure of continued existence. Each small solution builds confidence for facing the next challenge, creating a foundation of competence that makes even serious problems feel manageable. Tonight, as you test your repaired boot and find it solid, flexible, and ready for whatever tomorrow's journey demands, you realise that this forced creativity has changed you in ways that go beyond simple skill acquisition. You see possibilities where others might see only problems and opportunities where others notice only obstacles. The morning you wake to find the valley empty of the great caribou herd hits like a physical blow to your stomach. For 6 seasons, their migration through your territory had been as reliable as sunrise, providing meat, hide, bone, and antler. Essentially everything your people needed to survive another harsh winter cycle. But nature, as you've learned repeatedly, makes no promises about consistency. Standing at the edge of what had been their feeding ground, you read the story written in disturbed snow and scattered droppings. They were here 3 days ago, maybe 4. Then something, weather pattern, predator pressure, or simply some instinct bred into them over thousands of years, convinced them to alter a route that had seemed permanent as the mountains themselves. Your tracking party spreads out, looking for clues about which direction they chose, but the recent snowfall has obscured most signs. What remains tells a story of sudden decision, rapid movement, animals following leaders who seem to know something about coming conditions that human observers missed entirely. The implications settle over your group like cold fog. Winter still has months to run, and the stored supplies that seemed adequate when supplemented by predictable hunting now look disturbingly insufficient. This is the kind of crisis that separates surviving tribes from those that become cautionary tales told around other people's fires. But panic serves no purpose, and your people have faced resource crises before. The discussion that evening around the fire focuses on practical alternatives, immediate adjustments that can be implemented while longer-term solutions develop. Rationing becomes more strict, but not desperately so. Not yet. Hunting parties will range further, follow different patterns, target prey that requires different techniques but might be more reliable. You remember stories from your grandfather about the winter when the salmon failed to run, forcing his people to develop fishing techniques for species they had previously ignored. The winter when a rockslide blocked access to their primary gathering grounds, leading to the discovery of new food sources in previously unexplored territory. Crisis in these stories often became the mother of innovation. The small game hunting intensifies, becomes more systematic and scientific. Every member of the hunting party develops expertise in reading the subtle signs that indicate where rabbits shelter during storms, how ptarmigan move between feeding and roosting areas, which valleys provide protection for the hardy creatures that don't migrate away from winter's worst conditions. Your trap lines multiply and become more sophisticated. What started as simple snares evolve into complex systems that funnel prey toward capture points, that trigger automatically when animals pass through, that remain effective even when snow conditions change dramatically. The engineering challenges become puzzles worth solving for their own sake, mental exercises that keep minds sharp during the long dark months. Ice fishing transforms from an occasional supplement to a primary protein source. The techniques that seemed exotic when fish were merely a pleasant addition to abundant meat now become essential survival skills. Every adult learns to read ice conditions, to find the spots where fish gather in winter, and to construct and maintain the tools necessary for consistent success. But perhaps the most important change is psychological. The loss of the expected herd forces everyone to stop thinking like people who live in a world of reliable abundance and start thinking like inhabitants of a place where resources are always questionable, where backup plans need backup plans, and where flexibility matters more than efficiency. The children adapt fastest, as children always do. They turn the new hunting techniques into games, compete to see who can spot the most promising trap locations, and treat the challenge of finding food in an apparently empty landscape as an adventure rather than a crisis. Their enthusiasm becomes infectious, reminding the adults that innovation can be fun even when motivated by necessity. New alliances form with neighbouring groups. Information about game movements becomes currency traded for access to different hunting territories, knowledge about food preservation techniques, and stories about how other tribes have handled similar challenges. Isolation, which might have seemed like safety in easier times, now feels like dangerous vulnerability. The season progresses with a rhythm different from previous winters, less predictable, but somehow more intriguing. Each successful hunt feels like a small victory worth celebrating. Each new technique that proves effective becomes a gift to future generations. Each day that ends with adequate food and fuel for warmth feels like evidence that adaptation works when approached with patience and creativity. You begin to understand that the herd's absence, while initially terrifying, might ultimately make your people stronger. Dependence on any single resource creates vulnerability. Diversification creates resilience. The skills you're developing out of desperate necessity might serve you well even when, if, easier times return. The long nights provide time for planning, for sharing knowledge, and for developing the mental and social strategies that complement the practical techniques of survival. Stories become more than entertainment. They become repositories of wisdom, ways of passing along successful approaches to problems that every generation faces in different forms. By midwinter, the crisis has transformed into a different kind of normal, challenging but manageable, requiring constant attention, but no longer generating the fear that accompanied those first empty mornings in the abandoned valley. February arrives wearing its traditional mask of deception, days that hint at spring's approach, while nights that remind you winter still has teeth. Your people call this the hunger moon, when stored supplies run lowest and hunting becomes most difficult, when the gap between what you have and what you need grows wide enough to keep everyone awake listening to their stomachs argue with their resolve. The morning ritual of inventory has become a meditation on scarcity. You count dried strips of meat that have grown steadily smaller and tougher, examine preserved berries that looked abundant in the autumn but now seem pitifully few, and assess the remaining cache of nuts and seeds that represent your backup plan. Mathematics has never felt so personal or so urgent. But hunger, you've discovered, is not the simple thing you once thought it was. There's the immediate hunger that follows a missed meal, sharp and demanding attention. There's the deeper hunger that comes from weeks of reduced portions, a gnawing companion that colours every decision and makes concentration difficult. And then there's what you've come to think of as smart hunger, the alert awareness that comes when your body begins operating with the heightened efficiency of an organism fighting for survival. Smart hunger sharpens your senses in unexpected ways. Sounds become clearer, smells more distinct, and visual details that would normally escape notice suddenly seem important and worth remembering. Your body learns to extract maximum value from every calorie, allowing it to function effectively on less fuel than you would have thought possible. It's uncomfortable, but it's also oddly educational. The hunting party's success rates have improved dramatically over the past month, but not in ways that would have been predictable earlier. The large game remains scarce and unpredictable, but your understanding of small prey has evolved to an almost supernatural level. You can predict with remarkable accuracy where rabbits will be moving at different times of day, which areas will hold ptarmigan after different weather patterns, and how ice conditions affect fishing success. Your trap lines have become works of art, efficient systems that seem to catch animals almost by magic, but actually work through careful observation of animal behaviour patterns. You've learned to think like prey, to understand how hunger affects decision-making in creatures whose survival depends on avoiding exactly the kind of traps you're setting. The psychological aspects of hunger management become as important as the physical ones. Mood regulation, energy conservation, and maintaining hope when circumstances suggest despair. These skills develop alongside the practical techniques of finding food. The evening gatherings around the fire serve purposes that go beyond sharing warmth and light. They become group therapy sessions where people share strategies for coping with discomfort and techniques for maintaining mental clarity when the body's running on reserves. Food preparation has evolved into high art. Every scrap gets used, every possible nutrient extracted, every meal planned to provide maximum satisfaction from minimum ingredients. Soups that would have seemed thin and inadequate in times of plenty now taste rich and nourishing. Combinations of ingredients that would never have been tried when better options were available turn out to create surprisingly satisfying meals. The children handle the situation with remarkable grace, perhaps because they lack adult memories of easier times for comparison. They approach each meal as adequate rather than insufficient, accept smaller portions as normal rather than hardship, find entertainment in the creative food combinations that necessity produces. Their resilience becomes a source of strength for adults who struggle more with the psychological aspects of scarcity. But perhaps the most remarkable change is how the community is drawn closer together. Shared hardship creates bonds that comfortable times never forge. People who might have had minor conflicts in easier circumstances now focus entirely on mutual support. Individual competitiveness gives way to group cooperation, since everyone understands that the survival of each depends on the survival of all. Information sharing becomes more complete and systematic. Successful hunting techniques get demonstrated and practiced until everyone masters them. Food preservation methods get refined through group experimentation. Even small discoveries, a new plant that can be eaten safely, a different way to prepare familiar ingredients, get communicated quickly throughout the group. The daily routine has adapted to conserve energy while maintaining necessary activities. Movement becomes more economical, with fewer unnecessary trips outside the shelter, more careful planning of essential tasks. Rest periods are scheduled to maximise recovery, work periods organised to use available energy most efficiently. Sleep patterns change in interesting ways. The long nights that once seemed oppressive now feel like opportunities for deep rest that helps the body manage stress and conserve resources. Dreams become more vivid, perhaps because the sleeping mind has fewer distractions from hunger and discomfort. Some people report dreams that seem to provide useful information about finding food or solving practical problems. As the month progresses, you begin to understand that this experience is teaching lessons that go beyond simple survival techniques. You're learning about your own capacity to adapt, about the difference between wants and needs, about how community bonds strengthen under pressure. The hunger moon is revealing strengths you didn't know you possessed, and showing you that humans can function effectively under conditions that once would have seemed impossible to endure. The anticipation of spring takes on meanings that city dwellers could never understand. Becomes a hope so fundamental it feels like prayer. The first sign comes not through sight or sound, but through something deeper. A subtle shift in the quality of light that your winter-trained senses detect before your conscious mind processes what has changed. The snow still falls, the wind still carries its bitter edge, but something in the air whispers of transformation beginning in ways too small to see, but too important to ignore. You notice it first in the behaviour of the small creatures, whose survival depends on reading environmental cues with absolute accuracy. The Arctic foxes seem less desperate in their hunting, moving with a confidence that suggests they sense abundance coming. The ravens, those black-winged prophets of change, gather in larger groups and call to each other in patterns that sound almost celebratory. The ice on the streams begins singing different songs. Where it once groaned with the solid weight of deep freeze, it now produces subtler sounds, tiny cracks and shifts that speak of expansion and contraction, of a frozen world beginning to remember flexibility. These sounds become your morning weather report, more reliable than visual observation for predicting what the day will bring. But change in the natural world never arrives as suddenly as human impatience would prefer. Spring is not an event but a process, a gradual negotiation between winter's retreat and warmth's return. Some days bring false promises, temperatures that rise enough to create hope, followed by storms that remind you why patience matters more than optimism. The hunting changes again, requiring new strategies for prey animals whose behaviour shifts with the subtle environmental cues they're far better at reading than any human observer. Migration patterns begin to reverse, slowly and tentatively, as creatures start their gradual movement toward summer territories that have been empty and frozen for months. Your body begins responding to changes you can't quite identify. Energy levels fluctuate in new ways, sleep patterns shift, and appetite changes from the grim determination of deep winter to something that occasionally resembles actual pleasure in food. It's as if some ancient biological clock is beginning to reset itself, preparing for conditions that aren't here yet but are definitely coming. The social dynamics of your group start evolving as well. The intense cooperation forced by crisis gives way to more relaxed interactions, though the bonds forged during the hardest months remain strong. People begin talking about projects they want to tackle when movement becomes easier, plans they want to implement when resources become more abundant, and changes they want to make to improve next winter's preparations. But perhaps the most significant change is psychological. The bone-deep weariness that settled over everyone during the darkest months begins lifting, replaced by something that feels almost like anticipation. This is not a celebration, as it would be premature and potentially dangerous, but rather a cautious readiness for better times ahead. The daily routines that kept everyone sane during winter's worst now feel slightly less essential. The rigid scheduling of tasks, the careful rationing of resources, and the conservative approach to energy expenditure. These survival strategies remain important, but they no longer feel like the only thing standing between life and death. Snow conditions become unreliable in ways that are both frustrating and encouraging. Temperature fluctuations create layers of ice, slush, and powder, making navigation challenging on surfaces that were reliable for travel yesterday. But these same changes create new opportunities for hunting and gathering in areas that were previously inaccessible. The fire's behaviour changes too, responding to atmospheric conditions that shift more rapidly than they did during winter's stable deep freeze. Smoke patterns become harder to predict. Drafts create new challenges for maintaining consistent heat, but the amount of fuel needed to keep warm begins decreasing in small but noticeable increments. Equipment maintenance takes on new importance, as gear that survived winter's steady conditions faces the stress of temperature changes, moisture fluctuations, and increased activity levels. Tools that worked perfectly in consistent cold now require adjustment for conditions that change hourly. It's a different kind of challenge, less desperate than winter survival, but requiring different skills and attention. The night sky tells new stories as cloud patterns become more variable, star visibility changes with atmospheric conditions, and the aurora displays shift in intensity and frequency. Navigation becomes more complex but also more interesting, requiring adaptation of techniques that worked well during winter's predictable conditions. Food gathering opportunities begin appearing in unexpected places and times. Ice fishing remains productive but requires new techniques as ice conditions become less reliable. Small game behaviour changes as animals prepare for their own spring transitions, creating different hunting opportunities that require modified approaches. Your people begin discussing summer preparations, topics that would have seemed impossibly optimistic just weeks ago. Conversations turn toward tool repairs that can wait for better weather, shelter improvements that will require materials not yet available, and strategic planning for taking advantage of the abundance that seasonal change promises to bring. The community's mood lifts perceptibly, though everyone remains too experienced to let hope override caution. We won't forget the lessons learned during the most challenging months, but they no longer feel like the only valuable knowledge. Spring brings its own challenges and opportunities, requiring different wisdom and strategies for success. As you sit by tonight's fire, watching flames dance with the effortless confidence of a blaze that no longer requires constant feeding and anxious tending, you realise that something fundamental has shifted in your understanding of what it means to be human, in a world that makes no promises about comfort or ease. The winter that seemed like it would never end has indeed ended, though not with the dramatic flourish you might have expected. Spring arrived through 1,000 small negotiations between ice and warmth, between scarcity and abundance, and between the survival strategies that kept you alive and the adaptation strategies that will carry you forward. You survived, but more than that, you learned to thrive in conditions that once would have seemed impossible to endure. Your hands have become libraries of practical knowledge, knowing without conscious thought how to assess ice thickness, how to determine which wood will burn longest in different weather conditions, and how to read animal tracks in various types of snow and soil. Your eyes have learned to see opportunities where others might notice only obstacles, to spot the subtle signs that indicate where food can be found, where shelter can be improved, and where danger might be developing. But perhaps the most important change is in how you think about security itself. The old assumptions about what constitutes safety, abundant stored resources, predictable seasonal patterns, reliable sources of everything necessary for comfortable survival, have been replaced by something more flexible and ultimately more reliable. Confidence in your ability to adapt to whatever conditions actually exist, rather than whatever conditions you might prefer. The community that emerges from this extended trial feels different from the group that entered it. Bonds forged by shared hardship create a social foundation stronger than convenience or tradition alone could provide. Everyone has seen everyone else function under pressure, contribute solutions to shared problems, and maintain hope and humour when circumstances suggested despair. These are people you know you can depend on because you've already depended on them successfully. The skills developed out of desperate necessity have become sources of pride and pleasure that extend far beyond their survival value. Trial and error led to the evolution of trap designs, which now stand as both artistic achievements and functional tools. The food preparation techniques born from scarcity have created cuisine that satisfies in ways that go beyond simple nutrition. The resource management strategies developed for survival have applications that will improve life even when abundance returns. Your relationship with the natural world has deepened in ways that might seem paradoxical to outside observers. The environment that once seemed hostile and threatening now feels like a complex partner in an ongoing negotiation. You understand its moods and patterns more intimately, and can read its signals more accurately, but you also respect its power and unpredictability more completely. It's not that nature has become friendly, it's that you've learned to be a more worthy participant in its ongoing processes. Your mind is already shaping the stories that will unfold during this era. These are not tales of heroic conquest over natural forces, but rather tales of successful adaptation, creative problem-solving, and community resilience. These stories will serve future generations not as entertainment, but as practical wisdom, templates for handling challenges that will inevitably arise in different forms. Sleep comes easier now, not because conditions have become completely comfortable, but because you've learned to find rest even when circumstances aren't ideal. Your dreams have also transformed, now brimming with imaginative visions of unexplored possibilities, instead of fearful scenarios of things going wrong. The future feels like something you can engage with actively rather than something that simply happens to you. The morning rituals that once focused primarily on assessment of resources and planning for survival now include time for appreciation of beauty, for pleasure in simple accomplishments, and for anticipation of projects that serve purposes beyond mere necessity. Life has regained some of its richness, even while remaining grounded in realistic awareness of what the world actually offers, rather than what it might ideally provide. As the fire settles into the steady burn that will carry warmth through the night, you understand that this experience has prepared you for whatever comes next in ways that go far beyond the specific skills of Ice Age survival. You've learned to pay attention to subtle changes, to respond creatively to unexpected challenges, and to find satisfaction in making the best of whatever circumstances actually exist. Tomorrow will bring its own puzzles and opportunities, small crises and unexpected gifts. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet breathing of your sleeping community, warmed by fire and furs and the deep satisfaction of another day successfully navigated, you rest in the knowledge that humans are remarkably capable creatures when they need to be, and that you are, in all the ways that matter, remarkably and wonderfully human. Outside, the world continues its ancient conversation between challenge and adaptation, between the difficulties that test survival and the creativity that makes survival worthwhile. You've learned to speak this language fluently, and that knowledge will serve you well in whatever seasons lie ahead. Your mind is already shaping the stories that will unfold during this era. These are not tales of heroic conquest over natural forces, but rather tales of successful adaptation, creative problem-solving, and community resilience. These stories will serve future generations not as entertainment, but as practical wisdom, templates for handling challenges that will inevitably arise in different forms. Sleep comes easier now, not because conditions have become completely comfortable, but because you've learned to find rest even when circumstances aren't ideal. Your dreams have also transformed, now brimming with imaginative visions of unexplored possibilities, instead of fearful scenarios of things going wrong. The future feels like something you can engage with actively rather than something that simply happens to you. The morning rituals that once focused primarily on assessment of resources and planning for survival now include time for appreciation of beauty, for pleasure in simple accomplishments, and for anticipation of projects that serve purposes beyond mere necessity. Life has regained some of its richness, even while remaining grounded in realistic awareness of what the world actually offers, rather than what it might ideally provide. As the fire settles into the steady burn that will carry warmth through the night, you understand that this experience has prepared you for whatever comes next in ways that go far beyond the specific skills of Ice Age survival. You've learned to pay attention to subtle changes, to respond creatively to unexpected challenges, and to find satisfaction in making the best of whatever circumstances actually exist. Tomorrow will bring its own puzzles and opportunities, small crises and unexpected gifts. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet breathing of your sleeping community, warmed by fire and furs and the deep satisfaction of another day successfully navigated, you rest in the knowledge that humans are remarkably capable creatures when they need to be, and that you are, in all the ways that matter, remarkably and wonderfully human. Outside, the world continues its ancient conversation between challenge and adaptation, between the difficulties that test survival and the creativity that makes survival worthwhile. You've learned to speak this language fluently, and that knowledge will serve you well in whatever seasons lie ahead. Leipzig, a city reeling from the aftermath of the 30 Years' War. In that era of upheaval, few would have predicted that this sickly, inquisitive child would mature into one of the most versatile minds of the 17th century. His father, Friedrich Leibniz, served as a moral philosophy professor, and though he died when Gottfried was only 6, his library lingered as a silent mentor. The boy, solitary and introspective, roamed among musty volumes, absorbing knowledge both classical and contemporary. Leibniz's early education diverged from the strict rote memorization typical of his age. Largely self-taught, he devoured texts on ancient history, geometry, theology, and logic. He cultivated a fascination with how systems of thought fit together, a prelude to the encyclopedic breadth he would later display. Adolescence found him rummaging in obscure Latin works and assembling his compendium of philosophical snippets. By 14, he had embarked on advanced studies at Leipzig University, an anomaly for someone barely in his teens. This precocious youth carried a restless energy. While classmates regurgitated standard lectures, Leibniz pressed forward with questions of his own. Could there be a universal language of thought, bridging all disciplines? How did geometry and logic intertwine? Professors were both dazzled and unsettled by his challenges to established dogma. Although he soon completed the Bachelor of Philosophy, the faculty, wary of his age and ambition, resisted granting him a doctorate. Undeterred, he shifted to Altdorf University near Nuremberg. There, at 20, he secured a doctorate in law, focusing on how jurisprudence and moral philosophy overlapped. Yet formal degrees were merely stepping stones. Leibniz believed in forging connections among multiple fields. He developed friendships with mathematicians and theologians alike. Already, he envisioned a unifying project, a characteristica universalis, a symbolic logic language that might allow all knowledge to be combined and analysed systematically. His inclination towards systems thinking was not purely academic. The Europe of his youth was torn by religious strife, Catholics and Protestants locked in mutual distrust, and he hoped that reason, carefully deployed, might foster reconciliation. Despite his youth, Leibniz found himself welcomed into aristocratic circles. In 1667, he journeyed to Mainz, securing a position with Johann Philipp von Schönborn, the Elector of Mainz, who recognised the young scholar's potential in legal and diplomatic matters. Leibniz's tasks ranged from drafting political treatises to advising on administrative reforms. He approached them with the same fervour he once poured into library texts. Yet this environment offered more than mere bureaucratic chores. Mainz was a hub of ecclesiastical politics, and Leibniz honed his diplomatic instincts while pondering grand visions of European peace. Around this time he produced one of his first major works, a treatise proposing that France should redirect its territorial ambitions toward Egypt rather than wage war in Europe. Though far-fetched to modern ears, Leibniz framed it as a strategic pivot to reduce Christian infighting. Louis XV never embraced the scheme, but the episode illuminated Leibniz's readiness to merge intellectual creativity with real-world problem-solving. As the 1670s unfolded, his reputation grew. He dabbled in technology, reflecting a curiosity that extended to mechanical inventions. Hearing of Blaise Pascal's arithmetic machine, he designed a more advanced calculating device capable of multiplication and division. This mechanical contraption foreshadowed modern computing, though few recognised its significance at the time. For Leibniz, the device symbolised how logic and calculation might be harnessed to handle practical tasks, transcending philosophical speculation. Throughout these years, he remained an outsider in many respects. He was neither fully ensconced in any single university post, nor fixated on one discipline. Instead, he hopped between courts and libraries, from Mainz to Paris to London, forging correspondences with leading minds. He was simultaneously enthralled by mathematics, legal philosophy, cryptography, theology, and science. By 1672, he ventured to Paris on a diplomatic mission, fueling his love for mathematics as he encountered leading French thinkers. This trip would alter his trajectory, setting the stage for both collaboration and rivalry. Observing new approaches to geometry and analytical methods, he sensed that the realm of numbers held keys to universal truths. Yet the biggest breakthroughs and controversies were still to come. In the swirl of intellectual excitement, Leibniz's distinctive brand of curiosity was primed to reshape the foundations of mathematics and beyond. Leibniz's sojourn in Paris, beginning in 1672, proved transformative. He had expected to negotiate political matters for his employer, the Elector of Mainz, but soon immersed himself in the city's thriving intellectual scene, tutored by the Dutch mathematician Christiaan Huygens. He refined his analytical skills, poring over geometry, astronomy, and new algebraic methods. Paris at the time buzzed with the philosophical daring, hosting salons where Descartes' ideas were dissected alongside gossip on royal intrigues. Leibniz relished this mingling of worldly conversation and scientific debate. He quickly grasped that mathematics was undergoing a profound shift. Huygens introduced him to methods for calculating areas under curves, a fledgling precursor to what would become integral calculus. Fascinated, Leibniz built upon these kernels, striving to formalize a consistent system. The notion of infinitesimals intrigued him, quantities smaller than any finite amount yet larger than nothing. Could these elusive entities become the building blocks of a new calculus? Simultaneously, he grappled with deeper philosophical questions. The mechanistic worldview advanced by Descartes suggested a universe running like clockwork under divine laws. Leibniz wondered if behind these mechanical motions lay a tapestry of living forces, what he later called monads. Though he had not yet articulated this concept in detail, seeds of his future metaphysics were sprouting, fertilized by the cross-currents of scientific progress. Yet his Paris stay was not just about theoretical ruminations. He found himself in the orbit of diplomatic tensions. The Franco-Dutch War flared, rearranging alliances. Leibniz wrote treatises advising how the Holy Roman Empire might respond, and he debated theologians on reconciling Catholic-Protestant divides. These parallel pursuits, mathematics by day, statecraft by night, reflected his conviction that knowledge was a seamless web. Solving a geometry problem or proposing a peace plan drew on the same faculties of reason. In 1673, he journeyed briefly to London, carrying drafts of his nascent calculus. There he met members of the Royal Society, including the polymath Robert Hooke and the rising figure Isaac Newton. Although their direct interaction was minimal, Leibniz demonstrated his stepped reckoner, the mechanical calculator he had designed. The Royal Society was impressed by its ability to multiply, yet perhaps more telling was the curiosity his manuscripts stirred. Among them were hints of a new method for tangents and areas, skeletal notes on differential and integral calculus. Some society members recognised these as significant strides, though details were still sketchy. Returning to Paris, Leibniz refined his techniques, systematically introducing symbols to represent differential operations. He introduced the notation d/dx for derivatives, a brilliant move that simplified complex concepts into easily manipulable symbols. Where geometry had spoken of conic sections and tangents in geometric language, Leibniz's approach turned them into algebraic manipulations. Yet as he worked feverishly, rumours circulated that Newton had already discovered similar methods. Indeed, Newton's private manuscripts from the mid-1660s indicated a deep mastery of calculus-like concepts, though he guarded them closely. This parallel discovery remained embryonic, with Newton hesitant to publish. Leibniz, in contrast, believed knowledge advanced through open dialogue and swiftly prepared some of his results for print. He published a brief account of his differential calculus in 1684, followed by integral calculus in 1686, beating Newton to public dissemination. In the meantime, diplomatic events forced him to leave Paris. His employer demanded he return north, eventually taking a position at the court of the Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg in Hanover. Though reluctant to depart the Parisian salons, he accepted. By 1676 he was on the move again, stopping by London en route, where he glimpsed more of Newton's manuscripts, a fateful moment later invoked in accusations of plagiarism. The stage was set for a bitter calculus priority dispute, one that would dog him for decades. Back in Germany, Leibniz continued polishing his calculus. Letters flew across Europe, carrying his ideas to mathematicians intrigued by the new symbolic method. Yet beyond the realm of curves and tangents, he took on broader tasks, reorganising ducal libraries, penning genealogies, and planning scientific academies. This polymathic spree, though draining, illustrated his belief that reason could unify everything from princely succession to infinite series. He had no inkling how the Newton-Leibniz rivalry would erupt, overshadowing many of his achievements. For now, he focused on perfecting a language of infinitesimals, convinced that the future of mathematics hinged upon it. Leibniz transitioned from historiographer to political advisor at the ducal court in Hanover in 1676, a significant departure from the dynamic intellectual environment of Paris. Yet he embraced these responsibilities with typical zeal. Charged with writing a genealogical history of the House of Brunswick, he embarked on travels through archives and libraries across Germany and Italy, collecting reams of obscure documents. For him, rummaging in medieval charters or deciphering faded manuscripts echoed the same analytical spirit he applied to geometry. This historical research yielded surprises. Leibniz unearthed ancient claims that could bolster the prestige of his patron's lineage, fueling alliances with neighbouring courts. But the project took much longer than anticipated, partly because he approached it with scholarly rigour. He envisioned writing a sweeping, methodical history that linked genealogies to broader philosophical insights about human societies. Years would pass before his culminating volume, yet these forays shaped his sense of how knowledge intertwined. Mathematics, law, theology, and history were threads in the same grand tapestry. Meanwhile, he pressed forward with mathematical correspondence. In particular, the Bernoulli brothers, Jacob and Johann, became key collaborators. The Bernoullis recognized the power of Leibniz's differential notation, applying it to solve complex problems in fluid dynamics and infinite series. Encouraged, Leibniz resummoned his calculus further. He delighted in seeing how these intangible infinitesimals produced tangible results. Mechanical curves, ballistic trajectories, planetary motions, everything seemed ripe for re-expression in the language of die and dx. However, the shadow of Newton was always present. By the 1680s, rumours circulated that Newton's supporters believed Leibniz had plagiarised from the English mathematician's earlier, unpublished papers. Some pointed to Leibniz's 1676 visit to London, where he had briefly seen Newton's manuscripts, but many in Europe regarded Leibniz's publication as independent and methodically elegant. Newton himself remained silent publicly but nurtured private grudges, uneasy about sharing credit. During these years, Leibniz also delved into philosophy. He corresponded with thinkers like Antoine Arnauld, a prominent Cartesian theologian, debating the nature of substance and free will. Gradually, he formulated a conceptual framework that would culminate in works like The Discourse on Metaphysics, 1686. This text advanced the idea that reality consisted of an infinite array of monads, each a self-contained mirror of the universe. Though intangible, monads formed the true building blocks of existence, orchestrated by a divine harmony ensuring a best of all possible worlds. This optimism, later caricatured by Voltaire, was in fact deeply nuanced. Leibniz never claimed the world was free of evil, but insisted that creation represented a divine calculus, balancing maximum good with minimal necessary suffering. His theology and mathematics converged in a quest for universal harmony. He proposed a characteristica universalis, a symbolic system uniting logic, arithmetic, and linguistic patterns, allowing complex thoughts to be calculated like sums. If realized, he believed, it would settle philosophical disputes through precise computation rather than rhetorical flourish. Though the project remained unfinished, it presaged modern symbolic logic and computer science. Indeed, centuries later, mathematicians would marvel at how his sketches anticipated Boolean algebra and Turing's machines. By the late 1680s, Leibniz had expanded his network of correspondence to include statesmen, Jesuit missionaries, and scholars in Asia. He was intrigued by the Chinese civilization, particularly its symbolic writing system. Could Chinese characters hint at a universal script? Could Europe learn moral lessons from Confucian teachings? These reflections typified his boundary-crossing curiosity. He championed the idea that East and West might find unity through shared rational principles, a stance radical in a Europe often dismissive of non-Christian cultures. Of course, everyday life intruded. The Duke demanded results on that grand genealogical history, but Leibniz's drafts ballooned, collecting dust in crates. He proposed projects like draining local marshes, improving mining operations, and founding scientific societies. Not all found traction. Some courtiers dismissed him as a scatterbrained savant, overloaded with half-finished undertakings. However, Others appreciated his seamless transition from engineering proposals to theology. In 1689, a shift occurred. The House of Brunswick-Lüneburg ascended in prominence as its lineage was poised to inherit the British throne, a possibility that gradually materialised. This development would entwine Leibniz's fate with the future King George I of Great Britain, complicating his position. Meanwhile, Newton rose to direct the Royal Mint in London and garnered even greater influence in English scientific circles. The stage was set for a transnational rivalry, both personal and intellectual, overshadowing the latter part of Leibniz's life. For now, he pressed on, weaving mathematics, diplomacy, and philosophical speculation into a single tapestry. The 1690s saw Leibniz at the height of his productivity, yet storms loomed on multiple horizons. He served the ducal court of Hanover, which grew more powerful as the lineage neared succession to the British crown. Meanwhile, Newton's circle in England simmered with suspicion over Leibniz's calculus. Whispers turned into murmurs. Had he lifted key insights from Newton's unpublished notes? Unbeknownst to Leibniz, these tensions would soon erupt into a full-scale controversy. Amid court responsibilities, Leibniz penned works on jurisprudence, economics, and even a treatise on geological theories of the Earth's formation, Protogaea. He systematically observed mineral formations, hypothesizing that the planet's layers recorded a hidden chronology. Although overshadowed by his mathematics, this interdisciplinary foray showed how he combined empirical observation with theoretical speculation. He insisted that theology, natural science, and history formed a continuum, each illuminating the others. One of his boldest philosophical statements emerged in Theodicy, published 1710, but conceived much earlier. There, he wrestled with the classic problem of evil. If God was all-powerful and all-good, why did suffering exist? Leibniz's resolution posited that ours was still the best possible world, shaped by the divine wisdom, balancing countless variables. Critics retorted that they minimized real horrors, but he believed human perception was too limited to grasp the cosmic calculus at play. This stance, while devout, also underscored his faith in rational analysis. Evil, in some measure, was necessary for the grand design. In mathematics, he advanced the discussion of series, engaging with the Bernoullis on infinite sums. The Basel problem, finding the sum of the reciprocals of squares, sparked fervent exchanges. Leibniz didn't solve it fully, that honour would go to Euler later, yet he contributed critical insights. Each letter to the Bernoullis was a miniature treatise, replete with breakthroughs like the series expansion for arctangent, which let him approximate P with surprising accuracy. He recognised that infinite processes, once purely philosophical puzzles, could be harnessed for real computations. His public life in Hanover took new turns. As personal secretary to Duke Ernst August and later his son Georg Ludwig, the future King George I of Great Britain, he orchestrated court ceremonials, crafted manifestos, and negotiated alliances. His dream of unifying European states under reason never fully vanished. He wrote proposals for a pan-European scientific league, hoping to quell religious strife through shared pursuit of knowledge. Realpolitik being what it was, these visions seldom materialised, overshadowed by power struggles. By the late 1690s, English mathematicians pressed Newton to reveal his calculus findings in print. Newton's Principia, 1687, had revolutionised physics but only hinted at his deeper fluxional methods. Sensing Leibniz's rising influence, they urged Newton to claim priority. Meanwhile, Leibniz had published widely, showcasing differential and integral calculus. The stage was set for a priority dispute that would soon overshadow both men's other achievements. The disagreement heated after 1700, particularly as the Royal Society became a hotbed of national pride. Leibniz found himself ridiculed in certain English pamphlets, which alleged he had spied on Newton's manuscripts. Leibniz retorted that his discoveries were independent, pointing to his meticulously dated notes. Polite private letters turned into acrimonious public statements. The irony was that both men respected each other's intellect, but were ensnared by partisans and patriotic zeal. Meanwhile, an unexpected complication. When King Charles II of Spain died in 1700 without an heir, European politics lurched into crisis. Hanover sought to position itself favourably in the shifting alliances. Leibniz juggled dispatches about the Spanish succession while also defending his calculus in scholarly journals. The intensity wore on him. He lamented that petty national rivalries threatened the shared enterprise of science. However, he wasn't a passive observer. Occasionally, he wrote incisive responses that intensified the conflict. In quieter intervals, he nurtured his grand philosophical system. The notion of monad solidified. He penned letters to Nicolas Ramon, a French diplomat, explaining that monads were windowless, reflecting the cosmos from within. Everything was connected by pre-established harmony, orchestrated by a divine planner. Some saw the concept as too abstract, but to Leibniz, it meshed seamlessly with his faith in universal rational structure. Even as controversies flared, he anchored himself in the belief that reason would outlast squabbles. At the century's turn, Leibniz exuded a paradox, revered across Europe for his sweeping intellect, yet increasingly isolated by conflict. He hoped to finalise monumental projects, his universal language, the genealogical history, and a systematic metaphysics, but faced finite time and resources. Approaching his mid-50s, he pressed on, certain that posterity would vindicate his endeavours even if immediate circumstances proved fraught. In the early 1700s, Leibniz's personal fortunes wavered. The Duke of Hanover, Georg Ludwig, was poised to inherit the British throne, which he did in 1714 as King George I. The occasion should have spelled triumph for Leibniz, who had long served the House of Brunswick-Lüneburg. Yet ironically, it led to estrangement. Eager to secure British goodwill, Georg Ludwig relocated to London, leaving Leibniz behind in Hanover with an unfulfilled directive: finish that massive genealogical history. The royal court in England barred him from joining until he completed his massive genealogical history. This snub stung. Leibniz had spent decades in loyal service, orchestrating everything from diplomatic memos to scientific reforms. Now, overshadowed by rising British courtiers, he found himself effectively grounded. The genealogical project, begun years earlier, lay in sprawling disarray. Volume after volume of research existed, but it was nowhere near a neat conclusion. Recognising the changing trends, Leibniz intensified his efforts by delving into dusty archives once more. Yet the scale was daunting. Each day, he uncovered more documents. Each discovered clue hinted at new angles to explore. Meanwhile, calculus controversy festered. In 1712, the Royal Society formed a committee, dominated by Newton's allies, to investigate the Newton-Leibniz priority question. Predictably, it concluded that Newton had discovered calculus first, and strongly implied that Leibniz was less than honest. The subsequent report, known as the Commercium Epistolicum, read like an indictment. Leibniz protested vigorously, labelling the inquiry biased. He pointed to dated manuscripts from 1675 showing his own independent progress. Newton's supporters dismissed his protestations as a cunning interloper. Outside England, many mathematicians still sided with Leibniz, or at least viewed the matter as a parallel discovery. However, his reputation suffered significant damage. Despite the challenges, he persevered. The Academy of Sciences in Berlin, which he had helped establish in 1700, provided a platform for his scientific ambitions. With the support of Sophie Charlotte of Hanover, mother of Georg Ludwig and a kindred intellectual spirit, he had co-founded this academy to nurture scientific collaboration in the German states. Even after Sophie Charlotte's death, Leibniz remained its figurehead, though financial struggles dogged the institution. He offered lectures on logic, mathematics, and moral philosophy, hoping to attract brilliant minds and forge a European network of savants. Results were mixed, but the dream persisted. Despite controversies, he found pockets of solace among younger mathematicians. In 1708, for instance, a Swiss genius named Leonhard Euler was born. Though still a child, Euler would one day become a champion of Leibniz's notation. The seeds of future vindication were quietly planted. Meanwhile, the Bernoulli family continued to produce advanced results using Leibnizian methods. Johann Bernoulli and his pupils solved differential equations that shaped mechanics, all under the conceptual umbrella Leibniz had fashioned. Philosophically, he refined his monadology, culminating in a short treatise known simply as the Monadology around 1714. Written in French, it outlined how each monade was a windowless centre of perception, synchronized by a divine plan. While abstract, It explained everything from the illusions of causality to the unity of the cosmos. To some, it read like mystical speculation. To others, it was a rigorous extension of his rational theology. Either way, it showcased an astonishing range, weaving metaphysics, logic, and mathematics into a cohesive worldview. All the while, his health declined. He suffered from gout and other ailments, exacerbated by long hours hunched over manuscripts. His residence in Hanover was lined with notes, prototypes of mechanical devices, half-written manuscripts on code-making, plus stacks of philosophical correspondences. Observers sometimes thought him a hoarder of ideas, forever on the brink of finalising a grand synthesis, but never quite concluding. Indeed, his insatiable curiosity served as both a boon and a burden. Socially, he was increasingly lonely. Many of his closest patrons had died or drifted away. Georg Ludwig, now George I, rarely consulted him. Newton's circle spread rumours that cast him as discredited. The younger generation in the German courts found him eccentric, yet a small cadre of devotees recognised his brilliance. They offered quiet encouragement, urging him to publish more systematically. He tried, but the burdens of the genealogical history kept him tethered, and his myriad side projects swallowed time. Approaching 70, Leibniz felt the weight of unfulfilled plans. He yearned to see a universal science bridging all disciplines. He hoped to unify Christian denominations through reason, to build mechanical calculating machines for everyday tasks, and to see his beloved academies flourish. Yet life had whittled away many illusions. He pressed on, determined that if the present age misunderstood him, future centuries might unravel and appreciate the kaleidoscopic tapestry he had woven. By 1716, Leibniz's health was in a rapid downward spiral. Gout attacks became frequent, confining him to his chambers. He corresponded relentlessly from his sickbed, dictating letters that ranged from theological queries to advanced calculus problems. The genealogical project, still incomplete, weighed upon him like a perpetual storm cloud. He fretted that his inability to deliver it kept him alienated from the court he once served so faithfully. Despite physical torment, his mind remained agile. In these final months, he drafted addenda to his philosophical works, clarifying the nature of God's interaction with monads and reaffirming his concept of pre-established harmony. He toyed with expansions to his universal logical calculus, though few around him grasped the depth of this notion. Occasionally, local visitors found him immersed in code-like symbols scrawled in the margins of pages, attempting to refine the universal language he had long championed. The watchful eye of the world, however, was directed elsewhere. In England, Newton's star shone bright. The Royal Society bustled with new discoveries in physics and astronomy, lionising Newton as the era's supreme intellect. Among continental mathematicians, Leibniz still had defenders, but many avoided the priority debate, seeking to maintain favourable relations with English patrons. The calm acceptance that both men had discovered calculus independently was overshadowed by patriotic fervour. It pained Leibniz to see scientific enterprise tainted by a nationalistic rivalry, but he was too frail to launch new campaigns for reconciliation. Meanwhile, in Hanover, the genealogical archives remained a labyrinth. Leibniz's assistant, Johann Georg von Eckhart, struggled to impose order. The scale of the research dwarfed any realistic timeline. Leibniz's critics within the court whispered that he was stalling or incompetent. He tried to explain that thorough scholarship couldn't be rushed, but such arguments fell flat. Even benevolent courtiers held the belief that his diverse interests had dispersed his efforts, condemning him to incomplete masterpieces. In a poignant twist, King George I visited Hanover briefly in 1716, but made no effort to see his once esteemed advisor. Official records note the king's arrival, lavish entertainment, and dinners with local officials. Leibniz, laid up in his house, received no summons. The slight cut was deep. After decades of loyal service, he was all but invisible to the monarch he had helped ascend. Gossip circulated that Leibniz had become an eccentric footnote to Hanoverian power, useful once, but now overshadowed by more straightforward administrators. Amid this gloom, a flicker of hope arrived. Mathematicians in Basel and Paris wrote politely to say they still used his notation. Younger scholars credited his differential approach for clarifying certain series expansions. Certain French savants expressed admiration for his philosophical breadth, even if they found some ideas cryptic. This acknowledgement cheered him, affirming that seeds planted in earlier decades still bore fruit. Yet the toll on his body was irreversible. In November 1716, he succumbed to illness. His passing was quiet, nearly unnoticed by local dignitaries. Legend holds that only his personal secretary accompanied the coffin. No state funeral, no grand eulogy. That a man of such towering intellect could depart so unceremoniously underscored how ephemeral court favour could be. Letters announcing his death trickled across Europe, prompting scattered obituaries. Newton is said to have responded with indifference. Others, like the Bernoullis, penned tributes praising Leibniz's brilliance while lamenting the bitterness of the calculus feud. For a time, his memory lingered in pockets of the continent, but was overshadowed by the mighty Newtonian edifice in England. The 18th century marched on, enthralled by Newton's physics as Leibniz's contributions simmered quietly in the domain of pure math and logic. Only later, particularly with the rise of symbolic logic in the 19th and 20th centuries, would historians revisit his manuscripts to discover how visionary his attempts at a universal logical framework had been. In death, as in life, he remained a figure of paradox, near forgotten by the princely family he served, overshadowed by Mohammed Newton in the public eye, yet revered in specialised circles that recognised the depth of his innovations over centuries. As his letters and papers were studied more thoroughly, the full scope of his genius emerged. He was not simply the other inventor of calculus, but a pioneering philosopher, logician, historian and diplomat. The universal tapestry he strove to weave would continue unfolding long after his solitary funeral. Long after Leibniz's quiet burial in Hanover, the intellectual world gradually rediscovered his legacy. Throughout the 18th century, the dominance of Newtonian physics eclipsed any hint of continental mathematics. But behind the scenes, mathematicians in Basel, Berlin, and Paris refined Leibnizian calculus. The Bernoullis, along with Leonhard Euler, integrated Leibniz's notation into an edifice that made advanced differential equations tractable. By the mid-1700s, the new generation scarcely questioned which style of calculus they used. Leibniz's notation had prevailed for its clarity. Still, the philosophical side of his work awaited fuller appreciation. His monadology circulated in limited circles, mystifying many. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire ridiculed the best of all possible worlds as naive optimism. In his satire Candide, Voltaire lampooned a thinly disguised Leibniz as Dr. Pangloss, forever rationalising horrors. Consequently, for decades, the Leibnizian worldview was misread as a Pollyannaire refusal to face reality. Yet other thinkers sensed deeper currents. Immanuel Kant, though forging his path, engaged with Leibniz's rationalist ideas. The tension between empirical data and innate concepts found echoes in Leibniz's attempt to unify logic and experience. In Catholic theological circles, his quest to reconcile Protestant and Catholic doctrines sparked renewed interest, even if his grand ecumenical project never reached fruition. And in the realm of language philosophy, scattered references to his Characteristica Universalis kept haunting dreamers who yearned for a perfect symbolic system. By the 19th century, German scholarship turned back to Leibniz. Historians recognised he was a key figure bridging the Renaissance's classical scholarship and the Enlightenment's scientific rigour. Scholars published new editions of his letters, revealing the extent of his global correspondence, from Jesuits in China discussing mathematics to French philologists analysing word roots to British astronomers exchanging star charts. Each letter showcased the universal scope of his curiosity. In parallel, the modern field of symbolic logic, spearheaded by George Boole, Gottlob Frege and others, unearthed Leibniz's unheeded manuscripts. They found he had sketched the basics of a formal logic, anticipating the idea that reasoning could be reduced to symbolic manipulation. This realization cast him as a prophet of the digital age, centuries ahead in imagining a calculus of reason. Instead of a footnote to Newton, he began to be lauded as a forerunner of computer science, an irony that would have delighted the inventor of the mechanical stepped reckoner. Mathematicians, too, gave him a fresh nod. Euler, Lagrange, and Cauchy had built mainstream calculus using Leibnizian symbols, unconsciously vindicating his approach. Newton's fluxions faded from textbooks, replaced by dx and di. Over time, the bitterness of the priority dispute waned. replaced by a consensus that both men made seminal contributions. Yet the clarity and adaptability of Leibniz's notation triumphed, ensuring that every subsequent student of calculus inadvertently echoed his innovations. Philosophers of religion revisited his theodicy, finding a sophisticated attempt to defend divine providence against the problem of evil. While few modern theologians embraced it wholesale, they acknowledged its significance as an early attempt at rational theodicy. Others re-evaluated his monads, seeing them less as random speculation and more as a precursor to certain idealist philosophies in Germany. Hegel, for instance, referenced Leibniz's notion of internal reflection. The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze praised Leibniz's folds, reimagining them for postmodern thought. In the 20th century, the digital revolution casts Leibniz in an even more prophetic light. The binary numeral system, which forms the basis of modern computing, had been explored by Leibniz centuries earlier when he studied the I Ching and envisioned representing all knowledge with ones and zeros. This revelation cemented his reputation as an intellectual who straddled multiple epochs, an aristocratic court advisor who also intuited the logic of future machines. Today, statues of Leibniz stand in Hanover and Leipzig. Institutions named after him foster interdisciplinary research, echoing his conviction that knowledge is one grand continuum. The genealogical history that vexed him remains unfinished, overshadowed by more seminal achievements. Historians marvel at his energy. He left an estimated 200,000 pages of manuscripts, many still unpublished. Each new trove underscores how one man tried to unify law, mathematics, theology, diplomacy, and mechanical innovation under a single rational framework. Thus, the orphan boy who once wandered his father's library in post-war Leipzig emerged as a titan bridging multiple disciplines, forging new frontiers in logic and calculus, all while manoeuvring through the labyrinth of European politics. His final years may have ended in relative obscurity, but posterity reclaimed him as a figure of kaleidoscopic brilliance. More than 3 centuries later, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz endures as an emblem of intellectual ambition, a reminder that the boundaries of knowledge can be transcended by those audacious enough to imagine all truths converging. Born in the port city of Genoa, Christopher Columbus entered the world under a roof that smelled of salt air and fish scales. His father, a wool weaver by trade, held lofty aspirations that his son might avoid the repetitive, grinding tasks of carding, spinning, and weaving, the bustle of people coming to trade in the harbour, yelling over each other in 6 dialects, made an indelible impression on young Christopher. As he wandered the narrow alleys that snaked through the city, he would often pause beside ships being loaded with cargoes bound for foreign horizons. No matter the dampness or the fierce winds rolling in from the Ligurian Sea, he remained entranced by the idea of distant lands. This fascination set him apart from others his age. He was far less interested in the local gossip about the new bishop or who would marry into which family. Instead, he chased fleeting rumours about gold-laden shores where people spoke in languages sounding like music. When he was old enough to leave home, Columbus began to sail modestly, short voyages in which he served as a messenger or a humble hand, making sure to note every detail. Once, while aboard a small merchant ship, he encountered a fierce storm that pitched the vessel so violently several men were lost at sea. Yet Columbus persevered, occasionally gripping the rigging and feeling both dread and a certain strange euphoria. He later recalled this episode as the exact moment he realised that fortune favoured risk-takers. The wind stung his face, but he felt alive in a way that overshadowed the fear. At that time, the known world for most Europeans was bracketed by misunderstandings about what lay beyond the horizon. Maps were often imaginative, featuring sea monsters, swirling vortexes, or vast empty spaces labelled terra incognita. Columbus devoured any chart or ragged bit of parchment he could find. In taverns, he listened to old sailors speak of land glimpsed through squalls and thick fog, and not shown on official charts. While some dismissed these tall tales as bar-brawlers' fables, Columbus tucked them away in his mind like precious cargo. He made sure to learn from the best navigational minds available. By day, he subjected himself to the strict discipline of mathematics, angles, distances, how to track the sun and stars. By night, he pored over translations of Ptolemy, or any scraps referencing far-off kingdoms. His curiosity was insatiable, but always tinged with pragmatism. Even as he immersed himself in daydreams of unknown continents, he meticulously built his fundamental knowledge. The pursuit of novelty was anchored in the discipline of rigorous study. A lesser-known anecdote concerns a letter Columbus received from a Venetian traveller whose name has been largely forgotten by mainstream history. This Venetian teased glimpses of a rumoured passage, a route leading west across the Atlantic to Asia's riches. The letter wasn't coated with the florid hyperbole common in travel accounts at that time. Instead, it was almost stark, describing a place where the sun set over expanses of water few dared to traverse. Columbus cherished that letter, convinced it held the kernel of a secret known only to a handful of traders or explorers who lacked the means to follow up on it. The Venetian might never have expected his words to incite one of the most daring voyages of the age. Yet for Columbus, that letter represented a subtle push, a sign that the improbable might be real. In the decades leading up to his famed expeditions, Europe wrestled with power shifts. Italy's city-states squabbled with each other. The Ottoman Empire flexed control over trade routes, and Portugal angled for maritime dominance. People in Columbus's circles debated the viability of sailing west to reach the spice-laden east. The question was more than academic curiosity. It came down to wealth, alliances, and bending the map to serve power. Genoa, sitting at the crossroads of so many trading arteries, was itself a testament to how maritime acumen could drive prosperity. Columbus was neither the best educated nor the wealthiest visionary of his time, but he excelled in marrying lofty dreams with a canny political sense. It became apparent to him that some power, be it Portugal, Spain, or another kingdom, would eventually roll the dice on a transatlantic venture, and he, poised with a solid track record of smaller voyages, aimed to be the chosen instrument of that gamble. He saw himself as indispensable in bridging the gap between the idea and the deed. Others might excel in theorising or financing, but Columbus believed he alone carried the peculiar mix of unwavering faith and nautical competence necessary for success. During these formative years, what truly set Columbus apart was not just his willingness to take leaps, but his ability to accumulate allies and supporters behind closed doors. He had a gift for speech, particularly when discussing navigation or potential wonders that might lie across the Atlantic. People described him as a steadfast man, perhaps even stubborn, whose vision shone through in conversation. Some dismissed him as overzealous, others were swept up in his unwavering confidence. Either way, they remembered him. In a society where reputations were currency, that was the first step toward finding patrons who could turn imagination into tangible backing. Stories about Columbus often skip from his boyhood in Genoa straight to his lobbying at the Spanish court. Yet these in-between years, during which he sharpened his craft, cultivated friendships, and scoured every port for whispered tales, were pivotal. They formed a crucible in which the idea of sailing west to reach what Europe called the Indies hardened into a driving obsession. By the time he embarked on the journeys that would etch his name into history, he was already a seasoned navigator with connections in multiple courts. Many might have possessed theoretical knowledge or raw courage, but Columbus combined them with a strategic sense of timing and persuasion. Ultimately, the sum of these experiences, the near-death storms, the midnight confessions of old sailors, the letters penned by obscure travellers, wove together. Columbus stood as a man on the cusp of forging something vast. He was ready to propose a radical plan to whichever monarchy had the audacity to endorse him. And that moment was inching closer every time he set foot on a dock, every time he gathered new bits of intelligence, and every time he closed his eyes at night, visions of uncharted coast dancing just beyond the darkness. Spain in the late 15th century was an agitated tapestry of ambition, religious devotion, and a desire to surpass other emerging European powers. After the Reconquista and the unification under the Catholic monarchs, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella sought new ways to cement their place in the world. While Portugal was establishing itself along the African coast, using caravels to probe new waters, Spain faced the possibility of being left behind. Columbus perceived this anxiety like a cat sniffing out opportunity. He had tried pitching his westward plan to the Portuguese crown previously, but was met with hesitation, some say scorn. His proposition sounded suspiciously like gambling with the unknown. Portugal, after all, already had an established route circling Africa. But the Spanish court was more impressionable, perhaps because they were eager to leapfrog over rivals in the exploration race. Columbus bided his time in Andalusian port towns, forging friendships with local captains, cartographers, and the occasional monk with an interest in exotic geography. He cultivated a sense of mystique around himself, dropping hints about rumoured islands beyond the horizon. And yet, winning over the Catholic monarchs demanded more than grand promises. Columbus needed to demonstrate some shred of credibility. So, he appeared at court armed with numbers and references. Although many modern experts debate the accuracy of his calculations, especially his underestimation of Earth's circumference, he was undoubtedly passionate about them. He insisted that the distance westward to Asia wasn't as colossal as mainstream scholars maintained. Moreover, he insisted on titles and privileges for himself if he were successful. This wasn't mere hubris. He believed that if he discovered new lands or profitable routes, he deserved recognition and wealth. It's worth noting that Columbus, as a man of his era, cloaked his intentions in religious justifications. He talked about bringing Christianity to the far reaches of the world. This approach resonated with an Iberian court fresh from the triumph over Granada and eager to spread Catholic influence abroad. But behind the religious language, there was also a shrewd negotiator who understood that spiritual rhetoric often smoothed the path toward funding. If you could couch your proposed voyage in terms of salvation or the glory of God, you'd find fewer obstacles in the corridors of power. What followed were months, some say years, of haggling. Advisors to the crown debated whether Columbus was an inspired savant or a fool. Traditional geographers scoffed, referencing ancient authorities who argued that the Atlantic was vast, filled with unknown dangers. A few murmured that even if Columbus did find land, it could be an inhospitable wilderness unworthy of the trouble. Columbus, however, radiated a calm sense of certainty. He occasionally flashed a map, though how detailed these charts were remains a mystery. Scholars have speculated for centuries about the source of his unwavering assurance. Some posit hidden documents or secret knowledge gleaned from seafarers who stumbled upon unknown islets. Others assume it was sheer stubbornness, an unshakable conviction that a western sea route must exist. Eventually, the Catholic monarchs took a calculated risk. They granted Columbus the funds for 3 ships, a modest investment from their perspective. The arrangement was that if he found nothing, the loss would be brushed aside by the Spanish treasury, but if he succeeded, Spain would catapult ahead in the scramble for new lands and trading routes. The recollection of Portugal's prosperity from gold and spices weighed heavily on their minds. Nobody wanted to miss out on the next wave of riches. Columbus, exultant with the royal nod, hurried to assemble a crew. People often overlook the question of how Columbus gathered those men. It's true many were from modest backgrounds, with some rumoured to be on the run from the law, hoping to escape their past in the expanse of the ocean. But it wasn't just desperados who signed up. Skilled navigators from Palos, Huelva, and beyond joined, intrigued by the potential for fortune. The ships, commonly referred to in simplified form as the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, were repurposed commercial vessels, not the grand, specialised craft of some modern imagination. In those final days before departure, Columbus prayed publicly at small monasteries and confided in a handful of confidants. The air crackled with anticipation. Coastal communities whispered about the boldness of it all. Some saw it as an act of madness or vanity. Others felt the giddiness of perhaps witnessing the dawn of a new era, though they likely didn't phrase it that way. For his part, Columbus maintained a controlled composure, but one can imagine the swirl of thoughts in his head. What if the critics were right, and Asia lay much farther than he had predicted? What if the currents were too treacherous, or the men mutinied out of fear? Despite the swirling uncertainty, Columbus pressed on. In the context of the times, caution often yielded smaller gains, while boldness, especially in exploration, could reshape kingdoms and redefine maps. And so, in August of 1492, with the last fleeting gusts of summer wind, he led his ragtag armada out of Palos de la Frontera. Spain's coastline faded behind them under a brilliant sky, and all that remained was the emptiness of the Atlantic. No one aboard those 3 ships fully grasped the magnitude of what they were about to set in motion. Columbus was convinced that on the other side of that endless horizon lay a gateway to Asia. What he actually found would ripple through history in ways neither he nor his patrons could have envisaged. Yet that departure day, so often depicted in simplified paintings, was anything but routine. The tension on deck, the unspoken prayers of the men, the spectre of turning back if storms threatened, it all brewed a potent mix of hope and dread. Columbus, unwavering, stood near the ship's helm, mentally rehearsing his route, likely feeling the weight of his deal with Spain's monarchy on his shoulders. But as a faint breeze pushed them out to open sea, he also might have felt an intoxicating rush of possibility. Sailing into the unknown demanded more than bravado. It demanded an unspoken agreement among the crew that they would trust Columbus's instincts, for better or worse. For weeks, the men heard nothing but the wind snapping the sails and the hull creaking under the pressure of the open sea. Fears of sea monsters and bottomless whirlpools circulated in hushed conversations. Each day, Columbus measured the sun's position with the astrolabe, jotting figures in a logbook he kept hidden from prying eyes. Rumour has it he maintained 2 sets of records, one genuine, one skewed to soothe anxious sailors. As time wore on, their diet, initially bread, onions, salted meat, became stale and monotonous. Water turned brackish, tempers flared as frustrations boiled over. The sense of distance from any known shore was paralysing for some. A few men muttered that they should force Columbus to reverse course. Yet each evening, Columbus delivered a kind of pep talk, reminding them of the wealth rumoured to be waiting just beyond the horizon, of the possibility that each day's sail brought them closer to Asia's spice markets. From a modern perspective, such promises might seem manipulative, but within their historical context, Columbus was playing the necessary role of morale builder. Along the voyage, certain signs stirred fleeting moments of optimism, floating clusters of seaweed, stray birds overhead, even the faint smell of unfamiliar vegetation on the breeze. Sailors latched onto these clues like lifelines, interpreting them as evidence that land must be near. Some historians argue that these were the crucial threads holding the expedition together when minds threatened to unravel. Columbus, however, rarely displayed his own doubts. His journals hint at the internal turmoil he felt when days stretched into weeks and no solid coastline materialised. But to the men, he projected unwavering determination. Then came a fateful night in October, when the cry of "Tierra, Tierra" finally broke the silence. The men scrambled to the sides of the ship, eyes scanning the dark horizon. Shrouded in moonlight was a low, dark outline that could only be land. Relief, excitement, and a twinge of disbelief shot through the crew. They had survived the dreaded emptiness. When morning came, they saw a lush island, beaches gleaming under the sun. Columbus, convinced he was near Asia, unfurled the Spanish flag and claimed the land for the crown. In his diary, he described the island's inhabitants as friendly, curious, and naive about European ways, though he likely wrote with the tinted lens of an outsider imposing his own worldview. The early interactions between Columbus and the indigenous people, often referred to as the Taino, began with gestures of goodwill. Small gifts of glass beads and trinkets were exchanged for parrots, cotton, and rudimentary gold ornaments. Columbus interpreted these gestures in a context shaped by centuries of European feudal and mercantile culture. He wrote excitedly about the potential for future riches and the ease with which Spain might extend its reach across these lands. That initial moment of wonder, 2 distinct worlds meeting for the first time, held a fragile promise of mutual discovery. Yet history shows us how illusions can fracture under the weight of greed and cultural misunderstanding. Columbus recorded that some of the islanders directed him farther to the south and west, mentioning places with greater wealth. So, he pressed on, navigating among the islands of what we now call the Caribbean. The further he travelled, the more he convinced himself that the Grand Khan's palaces might lie just around the next coastline. He heard stories, interpreted them through his own lens, and wrote letters back to Spain brimming with excitement. However, the land was not the Asia of silks and spices he had imagined. The mistake was largely geographical. The world was far bigger than he had presumed. Unwittingly, Columbus had stumbled upon a separate continent that was new only to Europeans, though not to the millions who already lived there. The seeds of future conflict were sown in these early encounters. The Spanish crown's policy was expansionist, steeped in an ideology of superiority. and Columbus's reports about malleable islanders only fueled the monarch's ambitions. He built a makeshift fort on Hispaniola, leaving some men behind while he returned to Spain with captured islanders as evidence of his discoveries. In modern eyes, that action signals a grim foreshadowing of how the New World's inhabitants would be treated, as curiosities, labour sources, or impediments to colonial aims. But in Columbus's time, such manoeuvres were considered strategic. He wanted to ensure further funding by demonstrating tangible results. Returning with natives, though entirely unethical by contemporary standards, served as proof that he wasn't just spinning tall tales. As he sailed back, Columbus already envisioned subsequent expeditions, likely anticipated wealth, honours, and a permanent place in the aristocracy. He had entered the islands as an emissary of a new empire in the making. Much like a businessman presenting a prototype to investors, he came back with enough evidence to secure additional patronage from Spain. Royal receptions greeted him upon his return, and he responded by describing the islands as paradises brimming with potential for Christian conversion and resource extraction. The tale of first contact is often romanticised, but the reality was more complex and ominous. Suspicion lurked beneath the surface, both from the Spanish who found less gold than rumoured, and from the indigenous peoples who now witnessed the arrival of more foreigners seeking land and labour. Columbus's navigational victory had unknowingly unlocked a door that would soon see waves of conquistadors. Missionaries and fortune-seekers flood these shores. For now, though, in the immediate aftermath of that first voyage, Europe saw Columbus as a triumphant discoverer who validated the westward route. The next chapters would unveil the consequences of that discovery. For a brief flickering moment, there existed an in-between time when Europeans and native islanders engaged without fully understanding what was at stake. The aura of curiosity pervaded their interactions, but behind the curiosity lay a chasm of cultural difference and the looming possibility of violence. Columbus, for all his zeal and cunning, remained somewhat oblivious to the Pandora's box he had pried open. His mind was fixed on proving to the Spanish crown that he was the man to lead the next wave of expeditions into these unfamiliar waters, confident that wealth and glory lay just over the horizon. Not long after Columbus's celebrated return to Spain, word spread throughout Europe about the new lands. The name Indies stuck, reflecting Columbus's ongoing misbelief that he had neared the outskirts of Asia. In response, the Spanish crown organised a second expedition on a much grander scale. Columbus would no longer command a modest trio of ships, but rather a flotilla aimed at establishing a permanent foothold. Soldiers, settlers, and clergy accompanied him, each with their own agenda. What was the ultimate objective? Transform these islands into profitable colonies for the Spanish realm. The spectacle of this second voyage contrasted sharply with the tentative nature of the first. Resources flowed in: cannons, livestock, seeds for European crops. The monarchy envisioned these distant shores as an extension of Spanish civilization. In Columbus's eyes, the project was both an opportunity and a test. He welcomed the chance to govern as a viceroy of sorts, but the weight of responsibility also rested heavily on his shoulders. He had to turn uncharted islands into functioning colonies, maintain favour with the crown, and keep the natives from slipping out of Spanish control. Upon arrival back in Hispaniola, the atmosphere was palpably different. Where before there had been curiosity, now there was tension. The men Columbus had left behind in the makeshift fort had engaged in violent conflicts with locals, straining relations. The Taino were not a monolithic group. They had their own leadership, alliances, and internal politics, but collectively, they recognised that these foreigners sought to claim land and resources as their own, ignoring existing structures. Discontent and confusion spread on both sides, often fueled by the language gap. Columbus tried to govern, but the role required more than just navigation skills. Administering a settlement demanded diplomacy, patience, and foresight. Pressed by the Spanish crown for gold, he imposed demands on the Taino for tribute. This policy alienated them, transforming a guarded tolerance into outright hostility. Rebellions flared, and the Spanish met them with harsh reprisals. Columbus found himself caught between his promise to Spain that these territories would yield wealth, and the reality that extracting riches from these communities required force or, at the very least, intimidation. Meanwhile, friction also arose among the Spanish settlers themselves. Not everyone respected Columbus. Aristocrats resented taking orders from a Genoese outsider. Soldiers chafed under what they viewed as incompetent leadership. A swirl of accusations circulated, mismanagement of supplies, favouritism, and even cruelty toward both settlers and Minoan natives. Columbus strove to maintain a grip on the situation, but as ships came and went, they carried back to Spain letters and rumours that cast him in a questionable light. People who once heralded him as a visionary began to wonder if he was a tyrant, and yet Columbus managed to launch further exploration from these colonial footholds. He navigated around Cuba, ventured into Jamaica, and glimpsed more of the Caribbean's island chain. Each landfall brought new interactions with indigenous populations. Some initial encounters seemed peaceful enough, featuring small exchanges of goods or gestures of amity. But as Spanish ambitions grew, tensions invariably escalated into conflict. Even so, Columbus's spirit for exploration never truly dimmed. He continued sketching rough maps, confiding in his journals about how these islands might connect to the broader Asian continent. One underappreciated dimension of Columbus's second voyage was the attempt to introduce European agriculture and husbandry to the New World. Horses, pigs, and cattle unloaded from Spanish ships trotted across Caribbean shores for the first time. Wheat and sugarcane seeds were planted with the hope that they would thrive. These experiments would eventually reshape local ecosystems, though Columbus and his contemporaries didn't foresee how foreign plants and animals could disrupt native habitats. They also didn't foresee the profound demographic collapse that would befall the Taino due to disease, forced labour, and armed confrontation. Amid the daily swirl of colonial administration, Columbus also wrestled with personal disappointment. Precious metals seemed less abundant than he had hinted in his early letters. The dream of easy gold faded, forcing him to tighten the screws on both colonists and native populations to meet Spain's expectations. This pressure fueled further discontent. Some settlers plotted against him, drafting scathing reports to royal officials. Columbus responded with imprisonments and strict measures, hoping to maintain order and prove he could handle the responsibilities vested in him. He was not entirely oblivious to the unravelling situation. Letters he penned to the Spanish crown reveal a weary individual, pleading for more support, complaining that rebellious colonists undermined his policies, and defending his harsh treatment of natives as necessary under the circumstances. Historians continue to debate whether these pleas stemmed from genuine concern or a desperate attempt to preserve his authority. Possibly it was both. By this stage, Columbus was no longer just the triumphant mariner who had revealed unknown islands to Europe. He was an embattled governor, pinned between colonial demands, rebellious factions, and indigenous resistance. Eventually, the tensions reached a point where the Spanish crown could no longer ignore the colonial chaos. The Spanish crown dispatched officials across the Atlantic to conduct an investigation. Columbus's name, once applauded in royal halls, started to be whispered with skepticism. The monarchy needed order and profit, not unending complaints and allegations of brutality. Columbus, for his part, insisted he remained steadfast in his loyalty, that his measures were misrepresented, that others were sowing discord against him. But the drumbeat of criticism was relentless. These were pivotal years in which the promise of new lands collided with the practical realities of conquest. The idea of finding a paradise was replaced by the harsh realities of colonization. Columbus's navigational achievements could not shield him from the complexities of trying to rule a far-flung colony under the watchful, profit-hungry eyes of the scowl of the Spanish crown, and so, amid fractious settlers and indigenous communities on the brink, the stage was set for a reckoning. The once celebrated admiral, whose unwavering conviction had brought him so far, found himself ensnared in the bureaucracy and violence of empire building, an empire that demanded more than a dreamer's spirit could easily deliver. When people talk about Christopher Columbus today, they often reduce him to a single act, that of discovering America. In that narrative, the nuance of his multiple voyages and the complexities of his tenure as a colonial administrator often vanish. Yet it's precisely in the aftermath of these voyages that the full dimensions of his influence and his failures come into stark relief. As Columbus initiated further journeys, some leading him toward the coasts of Central and South America, he found himself increasingly marginalized by Spanish bureaucracy. This shift manifested most dramatically in the arrival of Francisco de Bobadilla, a royal commissioner tasked with investigating complaints about Columbus's governorship. The new bureaucrat, carrying the weight of royal authority, wasted little time in gathering testimony. Both Spaniards and local islanders recounted episodes of cruelty, nepotism, and questionable decisions. Bobadilla was apparently so appalled that he arrested Columbus and his brothers, sending them back to Spain in chains. Legend has it that Columbus wore his shackles defiantly, even when given the chance to remove them on the ship. He saw them as a symbol of injustice, proof that his loyalty and service were being repaid with humiliation. It was a potent image for someone who once stood triumphant before the same crown that now authorised his imprisonment. The question of guilt remains tangled in historical debate. Some accounts suggest that Columbus, overwhelmed by the labyrinth of colonial politics and the pressure for gold, resorted to extreme measures. Others argue Bobadilla's actions were also politically motivated, using Columbus as a scapegoat to appease the crown's dissatisfaction with the colony's performance. Upon returning to Spain in disgrace, Columbus managed to secure an audience with Queen Isabella. Accounts from the time suggest that he pleaded his case with tears in his eyes, lamenting how he had been treated. The Queen, who once supported him so fervently, was moved enough to release him. However, his authority over the New World territories would never be fully restored. The monarchy recognised his contributions as an explorer, but deemed his administrative methods unacceptable, or at least too fraught with controversy to continue under his leadership. Despite these setbacks, Columbus managed to mount a fourth voyage, albeit with far fewer resources and a more modest mission, to find a passage to the Indian Ocean. He skirted the coasts of Central America, enduring hurricanes, shipwrecks, and near mutinies. This journey carried a distinct sense of desperation. Columbus remained convinced he could unstumble upon a maritime strait that would vindicate his original thesis, that these lands were indeed part of Asia's outskirts. He found no such passage, of course, and ended up stranded in Jamaica for a time, relying on the uneasy goodwill of local communities to survive. During that ordeal, Columbus famously exploited his knowledge of an upcoming lunar eclipse to secure provisions from the indigenous people. By predicting the moon would turn dark as a sign of divine displeasure if they withheld supplies, he manipulated the local population. This episode underscores the lengths he would go to maintain authority in precarious circumstances, and it also points to the lopsided power dynamics at play. Even when cut off from Spanish support, Columbus found ways to leverage advanced European knowledge, like astronomy, for short-term advantage. Eventually he managed to return to Spain in failing health, battered by the years at sea. The illusions that he might still be recognised as the viceroy of a new empire, or that he might uncover the golden cities of Asia, had diminished. Queen Isabella's death in 1504 further eroded his political support. King Ferdinand was far more pragmatic and less inclined to indulge Columbus's petitions for power or wealth. Over time, other explorers, such as Amerigo Vespucci, began to map the contours of the so-called New World, inadvertently challenging Columbus's fixation on Asia. In his later years, Columbus lived in semi-retirement, dogged by lawsuits over revenues he believed were owed to him based on his original contract with the Crown. The once bold dreamer was reduced to lodging legal complaints. He penned letters that oscillated between self-justification and appeals to higher Christian purposes. Even on his deathbed in 1506, he seemed unwilling to let go of the conviction that he had indeed found a western route to Asia. From a purely human perspective, these final chapters present a poignant figure. A man once lauded as an unrivaled pioneer, brought low by the machinery of the empire he helped expand. It's tempting to cast him as either victim or villain. He was, in truth, a complex amalgamation of ambition, faith, calculation, and tunnel vision. His voyages unleashed colossal consequences for countless indigenous peoples who bore the brunt of colonization's brutality, disease, and cultural upheaval, and yet, from a European standpoint, he undeniably altered the map and opened an era of unprecedented maritime expansion. One might argue that his ultimate downfall was that he neither adapted nor let go of his initial misconceptions. Had he recognised these territories as a separate landmass, he might have adjusted his strategies, perhaps forging alliances or seeking more sustainable ways to govern. Instead, he persisted, year after year, in claiming that Asia was just around the corner, that a strait or a city of gold would validate his calculations. This inflexibility collided with the messy reality of empire building. The monarchy demanded tangible riches and stability, not unending quests based on outdated assumptions. By the time Columbus died, he had seen only fragments of his grand vision realised. The world had indeed changed, but largely beyond his personal control. Ships from other European nations would soon arrive, each with their own agendas, as the scramble to exploit the newly unveiled continents gained momentum. Columbus's name would echo through centuries, but his latter days were marked by a troubled sense of having been eclipsed. The shimmering illusions that guided him across unknown waters faded into a legacy far more complicated and far more transformative than even he could have imagined. The ramifications of Columbus's journeys extended far beyond the man himself, unleashing a chain of events that would reshape the globe. With each subsequent ship sailing westward, more European settlers landed on Caribbean shores and, eventually, the mainland. While the Spanish crown extracted gold and silver from mines carved out of the soil, indigenous societies buckled under forced labour and diseases like smallpox, measles and influenza. These illnesses, new to the Western Hemisphere, devastated populations who had no immunity. Communities that had thrived for generations collapsed, their cultural practices disrupted or erased. Within a single generation, the vibrant tapestry of the Taino and other native groups was forever transformed. Some scholars estimate mortality rates well over 70% in certain areas due to epidemics alone. The Spanish approach was typically to establish encomiendas, a system in which settlers were granted control over local communities. They were supposed to protect and educate them in Christianity, but in practice, the system turned into a form of enslavement, extracting labour while paying minimal heed to well-being. Columbus's initial governance might not have single-handedly created these policies, but his methods and the Crown's encouragement of resource exploitation set the tone. The idea of the Columbian Exchange is often used to describe the massive transfer of plants, animals, people, and ideas between the old and new worlds. From the Americas came crops like maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao, which would revolutionize European cuisine and agriculture. Conversely, Old World animals like horses, cattle, and pigs quickly became fixtures in the Americas, changing landscapes and indigenous livelihoods. This exchange also included the forced migration of African slaves who were brought in to replace decimated local labour forces, grim escalation that Columbus may never have directly orchestrated, but that followed from the colonial blueprint he helped lay out. In a broader sense, Columbus's voyages sparked the European imagination. Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands soon launched their own missions across the Atlantic. Driven by rumours of riches and unconquered lands, competing claims ignited conflicts over territory, opening a new age of imperial rivalry. The lines on maps were redrawn countless times, each iteration leaving a trail of treaties, wars, and boundary disputes. And so, the impetus that began with Columbus's belief in a westward path to Asia spiralled into a global upheaval that reached far beyond the Caribbean. As these powers jostled for control, indigenous nations across two continents faced waves of new arrivals. Some groups formed alliances with Europeans, leveraging firearms and trade relationships to gain regional advantages. Others resisted colonization with every means at their disposal, whether through warfare or diplomatic negotiation. In that unfolding drama, Columbus's role was recast, overshadowed by conquerors like Cortés and Pizarro, whose direct subjugation of massive civilizations, Aztec and Inca, dwarfed the smaller-scale conquests of the first islands. Yet the initial spark, the template for claiming land under royal charters, traced back to Columbus's insistence that these lands belonged to Spain. Over the centuries, his reputation waxed and waned. In Spain, he was intermittently lionized as a national hero, though he was Italian-born. In the emerging United States, Columbus was mythologized as an emblem of pioneering spirit, particularly during the 19th century, when a young nation sought founding myths disconnected from British colonial rule. Monuments sprouted in his name. Poets and chroniclers polished away the unseemly details, painting him as a visionary chosen by fate. But as the modern era approached, historians began to piece together the darker facets, the enslavement of native peoples, the ruthless tactics to extract tribute, and the catastrophic demographic collapse that accompanied European arrival. Within academic circles, Columbus's identity has been dissected with increasing rigour. Was he a brilliant, if flawed, mariner caught in the unstoppable tide of empire? A cunning opportunist who used royal favour to pursue his quest for personal glory? Or a tragic figure who stumbled into a continent he never understood? living long enough to see his illusion crumble. The man's diaries, the letters he exchanged with monarchs, and the records of those who travelled with him reveal contradictions and complexities that defy easy categorization. Social movements in the late 20th and early 21st centuries further heightened scrutiny. Protesters targeted Columbus Day celebrations, calling attention to the brutal legacy of colonization for indigenous peoples. Statues were defaced, public debates raged, and local governments declared alternative holidays like Indigenous Peoples' Day. The conversation shifted from glorifying Columbus's navigational triumphs to examining the price others paid for his endeavours. Some people clung to the older narrative, seeing him as an icon of exploration and progress, while others demanded a more candid acknowledgement of the suffering woven into his story. In many ways, Columbus embodies the paradox of exploration, a thirst for new knowledge and wealth, coupled with the violent imposition of power over those encountered. Modern sentiments often try to reduce historical figures to moral absolutes, hero or villain, but people, and particularly those who lived centuries ago, exist in moral shades shaped by the context of their times. Columbus was no exception. He followed the traditions of his society: exploitation, religious zeal, hierarchical rule, while also forging new paths that irrevocably altered the world's trajectory. Reflecting on this, one sees that the significance of Columbus's voyages cannot be understated. Regardless of how one judges his personal character, entire continents were thrust into a new era of connectivity and strife. Commodities, pathogens, and cultural practices mingled in a transoceanic dance, with consequences that continue to unfold. That global transformation can be traced to this determined navigator who, despite incorrect assumptions and an inflexible mindset, was the catalyst for an epical shift. History, for all its tumult and tragedy, hinged on that moment he and his crew sighted land in 1492. With the benefit of hindsight, we might picture Columbus standing at a symbolic crossroads, holding the map of his flawed calculations in one hand and a fervent sense of destiny in the other. To some, he remains an adventurer who proved the feasibility of crossing the Atlantic, bridging worlds that for thousands of years had developed independently. To others, he represents the darkest impulses of colonial ambition, unleashing oppression and subjugation on societies that neither desired nor invited his arrival. Through the prism of 5 centuries, perhaps both views hold merit, intertwined in the complexities of historical momentum. In contemporary times, the story of Columbus resonates differently depending on cultural, educational, and national perspectives. For those whose ancestors hailed from Europe, his voyages might be hailed as the dawn of a new chapter in global affairs, an invitation to expand horizons and share in cultural exchanges. For the descendants of indigenous peoples, it can symbolize the devastating onset of invasion and loss of sovereignty. And for countless African families, Columbus's breakthroughs in navigation would pave the way for a transatlantic slave trade, forcibly uprooting millions from their homelands to labour in plantations across the Americas. If we peel away the mythic layers, we find a man both guided and blinded by the convictions of his era. Columbus believed in a cosmology that insisted Earth's size was smaller than many experts claimed. He also adhered to the conviction that Christianity had a mission to spread to every corner of the globe, by force if persuasion failed. Even as a young boy, haunted by the brine-scented air of Genoa's docks, he likely never pictured how far-reaching the consequences of his ambitions would be. If anything, his early dream was to find a direct route to Asia's wealth, not to become the instigator of a massive reordering of human societies. His navigational prowess remains undeniable. Crossing the Atlantic in those small vessels demanded skill, courage, and an uncanny ability to rally terrified crews. He navigated with rudimentary tools under harsh conditions, forging routes that would later become standard passages for ships of exploration, trade, and conquest. Indeed, the staying power of his story rests partly on the maritime accomplishment itself, proving that a transoceanic crossing could be repeated and systematized. Yet the same willpower that made him persist in the face of skepticism also fueled his unwillingness to abandon his original assertion that he was in Asia. This insistence might appear almost comical, given our modern knowledge, but in his time,